that plays out in a common pool resource. And I imagine some of you might have read this paper. And of course, this simple process that happens is that individuals try to maximize their own personal gain, and by doing so, they end up depleting a common resource, and as a result, end up hurting themselves in the long run. And of course, this is based very specifically on a model of human behavior, which is individually focused. And part of what we know now is that humans are not just self-focused individuals, and that's an overly simple model of human behavior. And so I think the simple way that I like to think about it is that people are a lot of different things. And three of the key components that we now know must be in a realistic model of human behavior include self-interest, absolutely, but they also include our capacity for pro-social behavior, our capacity for cooperation, reciprocity, collaboration, and coordination. And also, we have the ability to imitate and learn from each other, to change our behavior to match our cultural environment. And that's the key thing that people like Dr. Efferson and I like to focus on. So just to summarize the main takeaway from that 2015 paper that you've seen, the idea is that we can use what we know about how cooperation works in groups to focus more effectively on where we can make sustainability progress in the case of environmental social dilemmas. So if we want costly conservation practices, so if we want environmental conservation when it's costly for the individual, we should expect that to happen only when it's more important, there's a greater pressure on groups, it's more important for groups to conserve those resources, then there is a greater pressure, then there's a pressure on individuals to consume those resources. And so that might not happen a lot naturally, which is of course why it's difficult. And I underlined pressure here because in the paper we talk about this as a selection pressure. And there are a lot of different ways to think about it. It's not necessarily simply an evolutionary selection pressure. There's a lot of intentionality and foresight that humans have, of course. And sometimes that is the force that's really in action. So I also just want to drop something in here for anyone, which is that there are plenty of things that didn't make it into that paper, and plenty of gaps and holes and simplifications. And so if you want to talk about those or dive into how it could be improved, feel free to mention that. So the another point before I finally get to some examples here is that we're focusing on the group level evolution, and that is rare. And it's not just rare, it's rare sort of in academic settings to sort of think about group level of evolution. And it's also rare sort of in nature. And that idea is important. So we don't see, yes.
Another student raised her hand. So if it's okay with you,
Please.
Unmute.
Thank you.
I hope this time it's intended. So please, Matilda, ask your question if you like.
Thank you.
Please.
So I was thinking, asking myself, if you distinguish in the pro-social behavior, if you distinguish between people that would act selflessly because of conviction and people that would act selflessly because they see it brings them an advantage.
Yes, I think that's a great question. So, but if you're acting selflessly and it brings you an advantage, then it's not acting selflessly, right? It's ultimately acting selfishly if it brings you an advantage in the long term, right?
Yeah.
Or am I misunderstanding?
So I meant that the the definition of sustainable pro-social behavior was that it brings a cost to ourselves, but the benefit to the group.
Yes.
And I would yeah, so I would see that as a difference.
Yes, yes. So, and the difference is in the way in which the benefits accrue and the way in which individuals can expect those benefits to accrue to themselves. So for instance, maybe I see that in the long run, perhaps even in my own lifetime, it would be better if my country started adopting a lighter climate footprint, right? Because of all sorts of things. And so, but in the meantime, I take on a bunch of, let's say, personally costly efforts to try to reduce my impact and the impact of others. So yes, this is where there's a very large sort of gray zone. And in the nature of the paper, I have made it extremely simple, too simple perhaps. And so part of what we can say is that if the groups who are benefiting from effective environmental management, sustainable environmental management, are truly benefiting, then actually relative to others in other groups, their members will be benefiting as well. It must be the case. Now, mechanistically, though, I think it's important to say that I might not know, standing in the current time, that in the future there will be a benefit for me. And that's part of the challenge with a lot of the sustainability challenges we face, is that individuals don't know. There's a huge amount of uncertainty, almost unlimited uncertainty in a lot of cases, about whether the costs or benefits will accrue during my lifetime, for example. And so as a result, I might be personally motivated from a values perspective to do something. And maybe I'm right, and maybe it will have an influence in my lifetime, and maybe it won't. So what's useful in this case is saying, let's not have to think about whether or not individuals can model the future perfectly or do know what the future is, but simply, are they acting in a way which, from the perspective of the costs and benefits that we know now, appear to be altruistic? Is it costing them? That's a simple way to deal with it, because it's really hard. We don't know where a lot of the costs will land, or when, for example. So your point is a really good one. You're absolutely correct. Ultimately, there need to be group level benefits for sustainable behaviors, institutions, and ultimately those benefits will help the individuals in those groups. And so it will be in individual interest to contribute, right? So it won't simply be pure altruism. However, in the shorter time, large amounts of uncertainty, and has to be. So it often has to be altruistic members or actions that get the process started. Mm-hmm. Does that help a little bit, Matilda?
Yeah, that helped. I was thinking that this is actually very important for policy making, to know like how to make people act in a way that is less selfish and more altruistic.
Yes, so in the United States, we have a very big problem with people being altruistic, and we generally discourage it, which I think is a major mistake. We have a huge capacity for competition, and we use that, but we don't encourage often sort of altruistic behavior in the way that might be most beneficial for society. And so I think personally, and I can come back to this at the end, but I think encouraging altruistic behavior in particular cases is extremely useful, especially in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, the behavior needs to pay off, and should pay off for society as a whole. But in the beginning, to get things going, when there's huge amounts of uncertainty, we often need leaders, but leaders in a pro-social sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. So I was just sort of making the point that group level, the evolution of cooperation, so to speak, via group level selection is rare. It basically does not happen in nature, except for some very rare cases. However, it does happen when we influence nature, or when nature is constrained in certain ways. So a great example is the use of group selection on poultry in breeding chickens for egg laying. So if you breed chickens individually to create the most productive hen to lay the largest number of eggs, what you will get is a very vicious hens that are that attack each other. And so instead, if you select the most productive cages, you will get hens that are both peaceful with each other and lay the most eggs. And so this is a way that you can avoid what was a hidden social dilemma. The social dilemma might not have been there, might not have been apparent at first, but when you are selecting for an individual trait, everything else becomes secondary to that evolutionary goal. And so when you select for a group level output or a group level trait, such as high egg laying, the interactions between individuals become a part of the evolutionary goal, right? A part of the fitness criterion. And so as a result, you can increase egg laying capacity, and poultry breeders have, by selecting groups of hens in whole cages rather than individual hens. So the point is, this is real. It happens, and we can use it in management. Now, I think thinking about policy, we have two important questions. Can we measure the thing we're looking at, and can we manage it? I have a handful of examples that I'd like to go through relatively rapidly. The best one is at the end, and I don't want to consume too much time with this because I think maybe there's going to be some useful questions. So, but just a quick refresher about how this might play out. Here's a picture of a village in India where I did some of my research for my PhD. This village is one of about 5 in this region, and they all have streams that feed the irrigation network in the hills around them, but they all share a common forest. That gives us already a sense of some of the challenges that are going to emerge. And so we can compare the irrigation system with the multi-village forest in terms of what we might expect happens in terms of individual need for these really critical resources. They need fuel wood to burn and to stay warm, to cook and to heat, and they need irrigation water both to drink and to grow their crops. And so in the village irrigation system, selection favors cooperation within the village because every village has its own stream, and there might be competition between villages in terms of some kind of status, or there might be a way that villages imitate each other. And so selection favors cooperation, even though it's a challenge to cooperate. Overall, the irrigation systems work. However, in the forest context, where there's more of a common pool resource among villages, individuals absolutely still need fuel wood. And so selection or incentives, or whatever we'd like to call them, is very strong at the individual level. But the dilemma of conserving the fuel wood is at the level of between villages. And so this does not favor the conservation of villages, of the multi-village forest. And indeed, the multi-village forest is almost gone at this point. So that's the example, the sort of heuristic way to think about this. I've looked at a couple of different versions of this in Maine. I'm encouraged to study processes that happen in Maine, like blueberries and lobsters. And so here we have some iconic Maine agricultural products. This paper is a historical analysis of the blueberry industry from when it began to current times, but it focuses on two crises that happened with two agricultural pests, and both of those pests caused a statewide crisis. And after each of the statewide crises, or rather as a result of the statewide crisis, competitors in the state that are producing blueberries, these are industrial businesses, collaborated and then eventually cooperated and even agreed to tax each other, tax themselves, and to contribute to research to prevent further outbreaks. And so what is important about this example is that the possibility to cooperate was always available, but it didn't happen until businesses were going out of business, until blueberry producers were losing their jobs, were losing money. And once they were losing money, it became increasingly clear that they were all in this problem together, and that the best way to solve it was to work together, to set up systems where they could overcome it, to burn their fields together, to inspect their blueberries, and I'll spare you some of the details. But the point is, there was a crisis, two crises, and after each, the collaboration and cooperation between industrial producers of blueberries in Maine increased, as we might expect. And so this is an example of the importance of those costs. A second example, also from Maine, with lobsters, is about the emergence of these lobster gangs. So lobster gangs are actually informal enforcement units of lobstermen who will literally defend their territory in the water, sometimes violently, from other groups. And so, again, with my co-author, we go back and look at the history and ask the question, first, how did these groups emerge? And then secondly, how did they get some of the lobster conservation practices that they have? In large part, it looks like mostly these groups emerged and became strong and became highly territorial because of competition between groups, which of course is maybe not surprising. But in addition, they also came to defend, increasingly, not just defend their resources, but also manage them intentionally for the long term. And that meant making sure that individuals within their group don't take more than their fair share. It also means pushing for group level, state level limits on harvesting. And this became a really important component. So we see in this history, there are two different levels of group level competition driving industry innovation and also sort of conservation efforts. Now, these are simple conservation efforts. This is not trying to maintain biodiversity. This is simply trying to maintain productivity of an industrial fishery. So it's not a green scenario. It's a highly productive fishery, and it's ecologically rather poor. But the fact of the matter is that the group structure really seems to reinforce the idea that individual groups are determined to not only capitalize and defend their resources, but also to conserve them. So that's I think another good example. The most exciting one for me is not one that I've done. It comes from some research by some collaborators in Pemba Island, which is off the coast of Tanzania, where there are some forest-dependent communities the Pemba in general in Tanzania has tried to be aligned with the United Nations RED program for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And so what happens here is you have a bunch of villages, and the villages are asked through the RED mechanism to reduce deforestation. And if they can demonstrate that their deforestation and forest destruction has reduced, then they will be eligible for carbon payments that are made by wealthy nations to go to those communities. So this is a complicated mechanism. Obviously, it involves this international pressure. But part of what's interesting in this case is that there are already a whole set of villages and traditional institutions in these villages for managing forests. And so when the request to add more enforcement or add more monitoring or punishment or more effective forest management is made, it's actually not that far from their current status. But what it has done, it looks like, based on this research, is it has helped incentivize competition between these villages for managing their forest in a long-term conserving manner. So here are two examples, and I don't know these examples particularly well. This is my collaborator's slide. But in both cases, what we're looking at is individual villages, once they start protecting their forest well, others can no longer come in and harvest from their forest. And that makes neighboring villages want to protect their forest, because just because one village has protected their forest, it doesn't mean that they can't poach material and timber and other forest products from neighboring villages. So there is a competition to quickly close off forests for this reason. So this is actually driving the spread of these monitoring procedures, monitoring and punishment and the rest of it. So this is a really interesting example, and it's ongoing right now. And unfortunately, there are problems with the way the RED mechanism is working. But the spread of behaviors is a really important component of it. We have a paper for how to design research on this. So finally, let's talk about how to apply some of these things. And I want to stop talking. There's a great way to think about this from an evolutionary perspective is, where do we see policy diffusion being possible, right? Where do we see, particularly when things are voluntary and groups have the ability to change behavior as they see fit? Where we have a population of groups or of nations or of states or of cities, that's a good place to look. So for example, we can look at policy change in the United States. Policies can come and go, and it's good to ask the question, when do they diffuse, right? When do, say, sustainable behaviors or environmental institutions emerge? When do they spread? When do they become ubiquitous? And when do they fail? Can we manage it intentionally? No one, of course, is using an evolutionary approach to look at managing sustainability or environmental things yet. There are a handful of preconditions which help, however, and we can identify these. And they include basically aspects of the group, relationships between within the group, between individuals, and then relationships between groups themselves. The key one that I focus on in the paper, of course, is sort of competition to protect and conserve the resources. When that is strong, it's more likely that the resources will end up being protected. But there are a whole bunch of factors that contribute to that. What I'm more interested in now, just for our conversation for the last 15 minutes, perhaps, is thinking about not just what the preconditions are, but what are some sort of strategic levers that we could use to influence policy? And what's the simplest way to think about those? And so, there we go. So here are a few of them. Taking an evolutionary sort of perspective, we can think about variation, selection on that variation, and then the transmission of selected variation. And so this is a really nice and simple approach. And so it just simply says, to use an evolutionary toolkit, you just need to keep track of these three things. And the first one is, evolution is going to happen whether we want it to or not. Behavioral evolution is going to occur. The question is, are we managing it effectively? And so to do that, it really helps to focus on what the selection is. So make a systemic sort of social goal managing the target of selection. Of course, this is what my paper is a lot about. What do we want? Perhaps we want a sustainable, equitable society, right? And so then how do we achieve that? We can manage the way that selection occurs, and we can manage variation, processes that create societal variation, and we can manage transmission. For example, and a bunch of these are sort of borrowed from a recent paper, a recent blog post by David Sloan Wilson, who's really good at making some of these issues very simple. Variation can be thought of as a type of creativity, right? Entrepreneurship. And so can we encourage variation at the right level? So if we are encouraging individual variation or individual creativity, that's good if what we're looking for is individual level solutions. But perhaps in this case, what we're looking for are group level solutions, right? So when does a group manage its resources effectively? So perhaps we might want to incentivize competition between cities and innovation within cities to achieve certain sustainable development goals, perhaps. So encouraging creativity and variation at the right level is extremely important, especially if it's a social dilemma, because if we encourage innovation and creativity at the level below, we're increasing the strength of selection at the wrong level, right? We might be creating incentives for defecting in a common pool scenario, for example, or a social dilemma. Obviously, we should encourage it towards the right direction as well. And then finally, if we can say variation should happen at the level of the state, the level of the nation, can we have nations compete in some useful way around this topic, around sustainability goals? Finally, some variation will be valuable. Some variation will pay off. Some traits will be effective. And so we want to be able to encourage and facilitate the practice of spreading those traits, spreading the best practices, diffusing them, and of course, adopting, modifying them for different contexts. So this is a very simple list of what is really very obvious in a lot of ways, but I continue to see that our current policy frameworks often leave out one or more of these components. Even though everything here is common sense, when you include it all and organize it in this way, it often covers a set of mechanisms that aren't fully covered in other policy frameworks. And it doesn't have to be cultural multi-level selection. But if you attend to these three sort of primary components, I think you have a better chance of influencing policy in a productive way for societal goals. So two little caveats. Number one, Climate change is really hard because it's a global commons. This doesn't mean we can't solve it, but for multi-level selection, multi-level selection will not solve this problem. We need to decide to manage it collectively ourselves. And secondly, when we're encouraging cooperative group level behavior, it's really easy to become xenophobic or ethnocentric or racist, to sort of say, well, our group is good and other people are bad. And that actually is something, it's a correlation that we will see again in multiple cases where we have strong environmental management, but also a little bit of racism. They tend to go together because cooperation is easy to maintain when people are similar. And when people are similar, they see themselves as a group more readily, and they see others as outsiders more readily. So there's a problem there that we need to be aware of. But those are the caveats. And really, I think it's much more interesting if we talk.
Thank you, Timothy, very much for this very interesting talk. I think many of you might have questions. So now students are allowed to ask questions. Please raise your hand if you have any question. And of course, Charles Efferson, who has joined as well, might ask as well, but I will probably prioritize students' questions because this is our Proseminar. So first, someone raised her hand. Maria, you may unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, this time it's without accident. Thank you very much for your speech. It was very interesting. What I thought about a lot, like in the last years, and it's not essentially related to your multi-level selection theory, but to the whole like climate crisis blow up, which really blew up the last 3 years globally, is that I see that a lot of people, as you just mentioned in your last example, that some people really say that humanity itself is a virus, or it's better that humans, if humans would have never been like there for the world, and it's, we all agree that it's wrong to like make down like a certain group of people. And why people keep like doing this to our whole species, and that's okay. Like for me it doesn't make sense, and it's not, I can't understand why this is beneficial. I mean, like climate, like environmental awareness isn't even here for like a century, and that's like nothing in our evolution, and we've come quite a way. And why do they do? I mean, what's your opinion on this?
That's a wonderful question. It's a hard one, and I think mostly your reflection has to do with a lack of understanding of where we are as a species in among people in general. And so your perspective, it seems to me, is one of a larger time period, right? We have recently gained an environmental awareness, and we've built environmental management agencies, and we have international cooperation around environmental management. We're making good progress on an evolutionary timescale, right? Yes, there's hope in that. I agree, especially if you have a long perspective. But at the same time, of course, environmental crises are really bad right now and getting worse. Yes. And so people are panicked because they're looking at the short time scale, but also globally. I think that the most important thing, and one of the things that I sometimes highlight, is I think there's a really good reason to argue that humans are out of equilibrium with our environment. Right? So we have grown exponentially, both in population and in terms of our consumption of environmental resources recently. We're no longer growing exponentially either way, but we've grown gigantically. And that is not just a recent thing. I think it's an evolutionary fact that we're not just out of sort of ecological equilibrium, we're out of evolutionary equilibrium. Our behavior has not equilibrated with the environment. I think that's really important. And unfortunately, that means we literally have to evolve in order to sort of stay in some kind of balance on the planet. And importantly, there are other organisms that have gone through a similar transition. So if we look at other organisms like the eusocial insects, wasps, and ants, termite mounds, for example. Termites and leafcutter ants can consume huge amounts of material from their neighboring environment. But they have been evolving with their environment for 140 million years. Whereas we've only recently become really good at cooperating in groups to consume our environment. And if we overconsume it, that will cause problems for us, right? So I think there's a very real sense in which evolutionarily we are out of sync. We're out of equilibrium with our environment. So I think that's a good way to think about it, because we have to accomplish some evolution to be balanced.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
Yes, there are some other questions, as I see.
Or comments. They don't have to be questions.
So yeah, so if you have questions as well, comments as well. Kiwani, please unmute yourself if you like.
Thank you very much. I was thinking, like, with the multi-level selection model, which basically also highlights the danger of kind of targeting a level which is lower than the dilemma, so to speak, and that would actually make it more difficult or even select for like unbeneficial like behaviors and stuff. Wouldn't it then be always kind of like the best idea to target a level as high as possible, so to speak?
Well, yeah, sure, perhaps. I think that there's some very real, obviously, challenges with that. So let's take climate change. We would like global cooperation for carbon emissions. We would like everyone to consume less carbon-intensive goods, to have less carbon-intensive lifestyles at the global level. So, but for a multi-level selection mechanism, we need a population of groups to compete for that. So if we had many, many planets and each planet managed its own atmosphere, and we could look at other planets and see that other planets that failed to manage their atmosphere well had a really hard time, then it would be very easy for us to decide, you know, let's actually manage our atmosphere effectively. And everyone will be willing to give up some of our modern conveniences in order to manage it effectively, for example. But we don't. So we can't, in a multi-level selection framework, the way I laid it out in the paper, we can't target the global level. So I think often you're constrained by practicality, but also for some things, there is the right level. So those villages in India, for the irrigation stream that they have, the level that makes sense is the village, because that is where that irrigation system matters, right? So, but yes, you want it, I think, at least at the level of the dilemma. I think that's often the best way to think about it. But I think it's also fair to say that we don't really know what's happening if the, you know, very strong selection is happening very high above. It may ignore local challenges. And so that's an important consideration.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Someone else raised your hand. Matilda, if you like, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. So I think I can like join my question to the previous one. You said from a global level, we cannot see if, we cannot really analyze it, but if we take it on a smaller level and apply the CMLS to, like, for example, the village in India, and because what I understood is that the CMLS has mostly been used to analyze a situation, but if we want from that on create a policy based on the CMLS, like to see if it really works, and we are applying it on the right level, how would you measure that? Like, I could imagine maybe apply the policy with an RCT model, but how would you measure it?
That's an excellent question. I think you mentioned RCT, so randomized controlled trial is a very excellent mechanism. If you can manage it, that's perhaps one of the best trials, or one of the best approaches for examining the spread or the effectiveness of a group level policy. I think there are many ways to go about this. And there are two challenges. One is simply measuring what's happening, and it's very data intensive. You need a lot of data collection to understand what is happening in an evolutionary context at a given level. But at the least, we need to have measurements of all of the groups over time, and ideally not just their behaviors or institutions, but also the sort of costs and benefits that they're facing. And hopefully one could be able to measure sort of the ways in which they're learning from each other. But that's sort of more from a scientific perspective, as you were talking about. How do we construct research about this? I briefly went through a slide on the paper, which is about designing multi-level selection research for sustainability. And so there's a paper you can look up on that. For designing policy implications, though, I think it doesn't have to be a purely scientific process, right? Mm-hmm. If we have a goal of some group beneficial behavior, then that needs to be the focus of competition. And so the question is, and it doesn't need to be direct competition, doesn't have to be economic competition even, although of course that's perhaps a one way to do it. But if you can make your societal goal some sort of priority for the groups that you're looking at, such that they are all trying to create different ways of achieving it, and then facilitate the spread of those solutions, that's the simplest way to start. So an RCT is excellent, but it doesn't need to be an RCT. In the United States, we talk about federalism, simply being this concept of having a lot of participating groups, in our case, states, that have local policy control. So a lot of autonomy and a lot of creativity can find good solutions already, and then hopefully those will spread. And so I put up a slide about the spread of some of those, and a lot of them have gone to become national policy as well. So you don't necessarily need a top-down system to control it, although it's great to be able to measure things, for example, with an RCT. But simply, if you can encourage the system in the right direction and just encourage groups to be creative, to focus on the right challenges, to focus on challenges that are beneficial for the group, beneficial for society, and then to facilitate their transmission. That is a policy approach which doesn't require a heavy-duty scientific apparatus.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I see there are some more questions, and although time of the Proseminar is up, I think for all of those who are interested and like to stay, please stay and we continue, if that's okay for everyone and you as well. Timothy?
Yes, you have to chat. I have time.
So for those of you who have other things to look after, you can leave, of course. And for those of you who want to stay, please stay. So 2 more questions. Julia, please unmute yourself. So I cannot hear you at the moment.
I can't hear Julia.
Julia, are you there? So if not, then Miriam, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
I think Julia is writing in the chat, but shall I just?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I couldn't hear her, so please ask. You ask first.
Okay. So I was thinking about your model related with this ideology of individualism, which is very strong in Western countries. And I'm not really sure what my question about it is, but do these two go together, or would it not maybe be easier to I don't know, to promote a norm of cooperation instead of individualism to reach those goals?
Yes. You mean especially where this basic norm of individualism is not as strong as in Western societies? Is that the connection?
Yes, I mean, for example, in some of the Eastern countries, people are more willing to be selfless, or it seems
Yes.
at least.
Yes.
Which benefit then the group as a whole.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, there's already some research coming out of the pandemic with the coronavirus that societies which are more collective, which sort of have higher levels of individual focus on collective behavior and collective outcomes, which are often Eastern societies, not Western, have managed the transition to quarantine and all of the rest of the effective management strategies for coronavirus better, more effectively. And so basically, when you look at when you account for other factors. So yes, I think that's very likely possible. And it's interesting too, to think of it as if there is a true group level requirement for societies to manage their collective environment, it stands to reason that individualistic approaches will be beneficial until the environment stops having enough resources for everyone to be as greedy as they like, right, in a sense. And so it is reasonable that at a certain point, we will need to share because the resources have run out. And what that means is there will be a change in the selection pressures. Eventually, it will be better for individuals and society to make sure that resources are fairly shared and consumed in limited ways, so that the society can keep going. Yes. So yes, no, I think that individualism, and there is what I should say is there is some research about the difference between individualism and collectivism as a sort of general social scale that can be measured using surveys, and it seems to be related to, for example, this question with coronavirus.
Okay, thank you. And okay, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Well, you can ask a follow-up question. I'll try to answer more briefly.
No, it's okay. Thank you. I think I will think about it first and then. But thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so one last question from a student, from Julia, if you managed to set up the mic, and then Charles Efferson also has some questions. So please, Julia.
Okay.
Does it work now with your microphone?
Oh no, I don't hear Julia.
I can still not hear you. So maybe if you try to set it up, please go ahead. And otherwise, Charles, if you'd like, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions as well.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Tim.
Hey, Charles.
Thanks for the talk. Yeah, you too. It's been a long time.
Yeah.
So I just had a couple of questions. One that will come over perhaps as naively optimistic, and the other will come over as really pessimistic. First, the optimistic one. So you mentioned this notion that these global problems like climate change don't sort of lend themselves to a multi-level selection approach because, well, there's only one group, essentially. And yeah, perhaps, but you could also imagine that in some sense we have a group-selected psychology that's already in place.
Yes.
And over the short term, to somehow you could imagine leveraging that. And this is why it sounds naively optimistic, where we identify with the global community to some extent. So I'll let you answer that in a second, but now I offer the counterpoint, exceedingly pessimistic. And you mentioned the notion that one of the sort of dangerous side effects of emphasizing group level competition, let's say, would be something like ethnocentrism. And I'd like to pose a darker possibility where the groups in question actually use the behavioral domain of interest to distinguish themselves from each other. So think about something like the sort of party line among Republicans versus Democrats with respect to many environmental issues, right? So I don't think, for example, Republicans in general are running around thinking, shit, we really would like to compete with the Democrats in being pro-environmental, we're just not succeeding. It's exactly the opposite. They derive utility from the fact that they're distinguishing themselves in this dimension. And that sets a stable system that's not conducive, arguably, to widespread diffusion of pro-social behaviors. So.
Yeah, okay. So let me. Those are awesome. And the second one is not as gloomy as I thought it was. So that's good. So first, this question of do we need multiple planets? I agree. Obviously, we don't have them, but we don't in a sense. We do already have a group-selected psychology. Not only that, we already have a population of groups, a population of nations. And one of the things that we see is that for many reasons, nations, companies, states, cities are already interested in participating voluntarily in sort of climate reductions. And a lot of those things are spreading. And so for a whole bunch of reasons. It is possible to sort of say, well, look, humans have figured out how to manage ourselves in groups many, many times before. This is the structure of sort of, well, the way we think about self-governance in society, following people like Elinor Ostrom. Small groups of people, like in the villages I showed in India, figure out how to manage themselves and share resources and police each other over time. So is it possible at the global level? I think it is. I think it's harder. It might take longer, but I think you're right. We eventually will realize that we're in the same boat. And if we're in the same boat, then I think we will work harder at punishing each other for transgressing on a sort of global commons. So I think we will expect more of that in the coming decades. But so this other challenge, I think, is an interesting one. So you're pointing basically at a political division in the United States. That political division, I think, is very, very unstable. And as a result, the United States is very unstable. And I think in part what's happening is the level of selection, just politically, outside of any environmental issue within the United States is not at the level of the nation. It's much more at the level of the social or political group. So Democrats and Republicans are competing much harder with each other for control of the United States than the United States is competing with anyone. And so what that means is there's a whole lot of political and social and economic evolution going on inside the country, and that's part of what's pulling it apart. That's part of why our collective institutions, that's the major reason in my mind why our collective institutions are being, are breaking and are being taken apart. And so ultimately, this is in part a problem of having a country that is too large. Or another way of saying it is a country that doesn't have any other competition or doesn't see any others as being peers. For better or worse, the United States does not look to Europe as a bunch of peers. If they did, they would see a lot of policies which they could adopt very quickly and to improve their conditions. But they're separated by cultural barriers and by oceans, and so for a bunch of historical reasons, they don't feel like they have a lot of peers, and so they don't imitate. And so they're as a result, the United States is relatively unstable. But importantly, in terms of the environment, the rest of the world is doing a lot of what we're talking about to make it positive again. There's a lot of spread of environmental behaviors and policies between states, between nations in Europe and the rest of the world. So I think there's some positive components of that too. It's just that the outlook for the United States is not good.
Yeah. All right. Good. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Will you be around after this is over to chat for a minute?
Sure. I have another Zoom thing in an hour, but until then, yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Okay, great. So there was, I think, 2 more questions, or at least one from Julia, and she wrote it into the chat. So I'm not sure whether you can see the chat. So at the bottom, there is one.
Yeah, let's see. Oh, Julia, okay. I'm trying to ask my question here. It's more of a question of my opinion. I was wondering about the environmental movement and its efficacy in their communication. I feel like they're addressing first only the individual level, and second, that we would be in the last round, right? In a game theoretical sense. We found out that in the last round, people tend to defect. They become less altruistic. Because you mentioned the example of cooperation between the blueberry farmers. It went up after the crisis. So I was wondering whether the environmental movements are trying to make us feel as if we are in a crisis, or if it might be the wrong level to address in the first place. I think it's a really good question. So there's one example towards the end of the 2015 paper, which is about littering in the United States, throwing trash away. And so in the 50s and 60s, when people first started being able to buy in the United States disposable food packaging, you would drive to a fast food place and you would get food, and then you can throw bottles and things out of the car window because cars were new. There was a huge problem of people throwing away trash, and it piled up on the sides of the roads. And it was really gross, and people hated it. And so towns started to regulate it and say you have to put things in trash bins. But they even saw it more as a problem of what are these groups producing this trash, and can we stop the trash from being produced? And so there were a set of laws that started to be spread between states in the United States to require the producers of soda, soft drinks, Coca-Cola and things, fast food and cigarettes, to basically to extend their responsibility for the trash. So basically they would have to pay for the cleanup or produce some other way to take the trash back. So requiring the producers of the of the disposable packaging to take care of the disposable packaging. So that is really interesting. And so as a result, those laws started to spread. You'll see in that little vignette at the end of the paper that what happened was the companies who were the producers of the disposable packaging evolved and innovated faster than state law, and they were able to stop the spread of these extended producer responsibility laws by spending money to oppose them in courts, but also by creating an organization which was funded by those corporations. And the organization is called Keep America Beautiful. And the organization's design is to make littering, highlight littering as an individual responsibility. And so this is a very ingenious and clever tactic by the corporations because they now don't have to deal with the problem if littering is an individual responsibility. And so they will sponsor communities to get out and clean up the litter themselves individually, and to cast shame on the people who throw litter away. And of course, it's good to have shame for the people who throw litter out the window. But that organization still exists, and its primary goal is to highlight individual responsibility. I think this is a lesson for what your question is, which is, can we solve these problems with a focus on individual level behavior? I don't believe we can. I don't believe we are at that stage. I could be environmentally cooperative until I run out of money and run out of life, and it wouldn't really have a big effect on things. What we need are group level policies. And so that's challenge, and it's different. I do think that highlighting aspects of crisis, trying to potentially make the environmental crises more perceptible may be useful, but only if it's legitimate, right? If it looks like we're trying to create a crisis when there's no crisis truly there, I think that's likely to be a problem. But I think if I understand your question right, focusing on individual behavior is not the most effective way to go. And an example is this littering situation, where focusing on individual behavior is actually, is a strategy used by corporations that look to continue to pollute, basically.
So I think she cannot really thank you with the mic. She wrote in the chat, so
no problem, Julia.
So one last student question, if that's possible, and I'm not sure if that's still current or if that's from the last question, but Matilda, if you want to ask one more question, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's still current. So first a comment about the previous question. I think if you look at Switzerland, also we have a parliament system that allows more common people to access to politics. So I think if the environmental movement acts on the individual level, it can bring positive sides in the parliament. But that wasn't my question. It was more, I wanted to know your opinion. I recently read a paper from Horton and Horton called One Earth, and they make the claim that in order for the global world to make a change environmentally is on one way to have new enlightenment, but in another way to have a catastrophe that would bring people together. And my question would be if the coronavirus would be such kind of catastrophe that would change the cultural norms of people to make them be more cooperative and see how we can work together for a better environment?
That's a great question, Matilda. The first thing is, I very much think that global level catastrophe or large shared catastrophe is a very effective driver of group level evolution in humans. And there are a lot of examples of that. We have some simple examples in the blueberry research that I did, the historical research. Yeah, I've made a simple simulation model where the whole point of the simulation model is to allow global societal collapse, but also to allow sort of cultural evolution at group and individual levels. And individual level consumption often causes global environmental and social collapse. But in a few cases, we are able to recover from that. And when we do, we can, in the long term, have group level, stable resource use. And so my takeaway from that is simply that catastrophe often leads to change and can be a very effective driver of group level evolution. So yes. Now, what about coronavirus? There are already cases. I'm trying to track them, paying an undergraduate this summer to try to look at examples of basically pro-environmental behavior that are emerging as a result of coronavirus and spreading. One of them is the way that cities are increasingly looking to find portions where they can make walkable, and sort of shutting down car traffic and allowing certain streets to become places where people can just walk instead. This is a very small environmental change, but it seems to be one that's catching on and spreading. So can coronavirus be a start of this? Yes, I hope so. I think there are a lot of ways in which, trying to be optimistic, that it could contribute. One, I think, is that for people who are paying attention, we see there is a very big environmental benefit from coronavirus. Even if it's a short-term one, carbon emissions are way down. Water and air quality are vastly improved. If we can do that by mistake, basically, maybe there's a way we can do that more effectively. And I think that that sort of will occur to people, right? Of course, it's not good to, have this huge problem, but maybe we can achieve that without having to shut down the economy, for example. Also, the idea of, the way we've been running things hasn't worked really well for this case of basically a fancy flu. So if we need to change things so that we don't get a fancy flu and have to shut down our economy and everything else, then maybe it's reasonable that we have to change things to avoid other problems like climate change. And so I do think and hope that there is some way in which this global shared catastrophe will make it more plausible for people that there are other potential global shared catastrophes that are close and that we might avoid better. So that's my hope. But I don't think coronavirus by itself is going to, I think with regards to my country, for example, I think things are going to go back to normal relatively soon, in a couple of years. We'll go back to a high carbon intensive lifestyle very rapidly. But I do think the shared catastrophe helps and can drive sort of group level solutions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, great. Thank you all for all your questions, and thank you so much, Timothy, for taking your time to answering them and for your talk.
My pleasure.
So for the students, I think we end here. So you're free to leave, and wish you a nice week. And please let me know if you have any questions regarding your policy brief per email. And okay, yeah, so I read just in chat, someone asked a question. Please let me know per email. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice week. Stay healthy. And
thank you, everyone.
yes, goodbye.